And our final speaker this evening, who is Gavin Dudney, who's going to talk about AI. We are delighted to welcome the British Ambassador to ASEAN, Her Excellency Sarah Tiffin, to offer a few closing remarks. Three fast facts about our guest speaker. First, Sarah took up her post in ASEAN in April of 2023. And before her appointment to as UK Ambassador to ASEAN, Sarah was the Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy in Ireland. And throughout her career as a diplomat, she's also been posted to Poland, India, and Paris, and has worked at as the UK's representation to the EU and has been seconded twice to the Irish government. I hope I've got everything right there, Sarah. And finally, outside of work, Sarah enjoys reading fiction, traveling, and spending time with her family and friends. So I'm delighted, as I say, to welcome Sarah to join us, and over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, David. It's a real pleasure and it's an honor to join this closing session of the ASEAN Teaching English online conference. And firstly, and above everything else, I'd like to warmly congratulate the British Council and all the teachers and teacher educators for making this conference so engaging and so productive. Over the past month, there's been really impressive participation from teachers and educators from across ASEAN and beyond. And I'm delighted to learn that more than 25,000 participants registered for this conference, with videos of the sessions reaching a further 160,000 people online, which is incredible statistics. As the British Ambassador to ASEAN, I'm particularly delighted that participation from across the ASEAN region was especially strong. And for example, the highest number of participating teachers come from the Philippines, closely followed by Indonesia. And it's also a real pleasure to note that engagement by teachers this year also surpassed previous years, with some sessions receiving over 2,000 comments and questions, which is a testament to the enthusiasm and the commitment of the community that we have online this evening. The conference's key theme, Understanding Our Learners, really deeply resonates. We face many shared challenges in today's rapidly changing world, even though our experience and our country contexts may vary. And English language teachers don't only support the acquisition of the English language, but they also support students' holistic learning and their well-being. And this was clear from the engaging conversations that have been taking place all the way through this conference. I want to thank the teacher educators who've led these sessions for providing you as participants with fresh ideas and enriching tools for you to bring back to your classrooms. And I hope that as a result, you feel better equipped to support your learners. And I'd encourage you all to use the insights and the strategies that you've gained from this conference in your classrooms and in your institutions. As part of my role as UK Ambassador, I'm always keen to support British Council initiatives and those of wider UK organisations that contribute to English learning professional development. And the fact that you're all here shows that you are personally committed to advancing the quality of teaching and learning and assessment in English language education throughout this region. That's such an important goal, and I hope this conference has helped you all on this important journey that you're taking together. The British Council is also set to launch a Community of Practice Leaders scheme aimed at supporting teacher educators to build online communities of practice and share localised resources in different formats. So this isn't the end of your journey, and please do keep checking for upcoming posts and events. Once again, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to the British Council team, to our speakers, to our chairs, to our moderators, teachers and teacher educators for your dedication and for your enthusiasm. And I hope all of you, both organisers and participants, have got what you hoped for out of this conference. I wish you all continuing success, and we look forward to welcoming you back next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for your wonderful closing remarks and also for your time. I particularly like the way you highlighted the incredible participation we've had over the past few weeks. You can see already we're up to over 550 people on our Zoom call this evening. I'm sure there are even more people joining us on our Facebook Live as well. And yes, as you say, the engagement by participants throughout the conference, and also how the focus on how we can then apply that learning really shows the commitment to advancing quality teaching, learning, and assessment of English across ASEAN and all our countries in the ASEAN region. So thanks once again. You can see all the hearts and all the thanks coming in online as well. So huge thanks once again to Her Excellency Sarah Tiffin, UK Ambassador to ASEAN, for those words, and thanks everybody for all your expressions of thanks to Sarah as well. Sarah, have a great evening, and thank you everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
So now it's time for me to say a very good morning, good afternoon, and especially a huge good evening to everyone, including our audience joining us from China. My name is Davide Guarina Gilmartin from the British Council English and School Education team. I'm based here in Vietnam, and I'm delighted to warmly welcome you all to this, our final session of the ASEAN version of the Teaching English online conference for 2024. Although I know that in China, the sessions are continuing for another week. You have another 11 more sessions to go. Before we welcome our speaker for this evening, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items you can see on the screen there to ensure a smooth experience for us all. So during the session, please use the chat for general comments, but for any direct questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A function, and you'll see that the microphones and the cameras will remain off throughout. The certificates of attendance, these are available as editable PDFs, and you'll receive a link at the end of the webinar, and Zoom participants will also find it in the thank you email afterwards, and I'll share with you in just a moment a quick sneak peek of that. For your safety and well-being, please be mindful of our code of conduct. Let's keep our comments respectful and avoid sharing any personal information or commercial links in the chat. And if there are any disruptions, then our moderators may intervene. Also, if you have any safeguarding concerns throughout the remaining time, you can reach out to us through our email. You can see at the bottom left of the screen there, safeguarding@britishcouncil.org. And finally, please note that this session is being recorded and live streamed across various platforms, including our Teaching English Asia Facebook page and Teaching English China's WeChat video and Bilibili platforms as well. So by participating, you agree to be part of this recording. So now, with the housekeeping out of the way, it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker for this evening, who is Gavin Dudney. So today, as Gavin says, we need to talk about AI, a wonderful title on this very hot topic of AI, which we all know about generally, but also especially in the world of English language teaching. Before I hand over to Gavin, 3 quick facts about him, our speaker this evening. Gavin is the Director of Technology for the Consultants E, working in EdTech consultancy in the fields of teacher training, materials development, and AI, as well as in monitoring and evaluation of large-scale education projects. He's a former honorary secretary and chair of ELCOM at IATEFL. And finally, Gavin is a renowned author of a number of books and publications, for example, The Internet and the Language Classroom, and co-author of the award-winning publications How to Teach English with Technology, Going Mobile, and Digital Literacies. So he's extremely well qualified to talk about this subject. And so without any further ado, Gavin, a very good evening or a good morning to you in the UK, and welcome to you. Over to you.
Thank you. Let me just get my slide shared.
Sure.
Here we go. Hopefully you will be able to see those now.
Yes, we can see that.
Fantastic. Okay, good. Well, we can get started then. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for all the fabulous work you and everyone else has been doing on this conference, which is amazing. These kind of opportunities are vital, I think, to reach people in areas where, maybe more traditional face-to-face professional development doesn't happen very often. And I'm delighted to be here. Last, but hopefully not least, at least in this part of the conference.
Exactly.
My history in education technologies is 30 years old now. I wrote my first gap fill exercises for MS-DOS in 1994. Now, you're probably not old enough to remember MS-DOS, but it was a pretty basic black screen, white text kind of program. But in the last 30 years, I've followed technologies all the way through with varying degrees of excitement. And there were some key points in that journey which I think were particularly exciting for me. The advent of broadband, allowing us to be connected constantly to the internet. The exciting things that happened at the turn of the century with Web 2, when we suddenly got more interactive things to do. We could blog and we could podcast and all these exciting things where we could finally contribute to what was on the internet. The development of the smartphone was another key moment for me. Allowing us to do things that when I first started teaching would have required a suitcase full of tools, a video camera and an audio recorder and all these things. And suddenly, or at least relatively suddenly, we had all these amazing tools in our hands, in mobile phones. That was a key moment. COVID, obviously, was another key moment for me in technology. And that was a moment where I think I was delighted to see so many teachers who perhaps had been reluctant to embrace technology, having to embrace technology, and watching how some of those overcame their reluctance or their dislike of technology and started doing some amazing things. And I observed some absolutely fantastic online classes during that time from teachers who'd never actually taught online, nor who had wanted to teach online. And that brings us up to date. And here we are with the latest and greatest big thing, AI. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the session, which I'm hoping to do, given the time. I'd like to look at a little bit at the life cycle of emerging technologies, how they start, where they go, what happens to them. I'd like to look very briefly at technology in English language teaching and the excitement that technology engenders in many people. And then I'd like to think a little bit about AI, which is relatively recent. I think for most of us, it's probably less than a year, perhaps, since we first used AI, and now it seems to be everywhere. And then rather than doing what I think is often done in talks about AI in English language teaching, I'm not going to talk about marvelous tools and things you can do and things for making gap fill exercises. I want to talk a little bit about what I think are the issues with AI and issues which are particular to AI and which I don't think have affected other technologies previous to AI. And then at the end, I'd like to look a little briefly about how we can perhaps use AI in a safe and principled way in our classes. And then hopefully we'll have time for a QA. So do keep the questions coming in the QA window. If you could possibly avoid putting questions about certificates in the QA window, that would be great, because otherwise it's going to be tricky for us to spot the questions about the session.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that reminder, Gavin. And just another point as well, a number of people are asking in the Q&A, do we have a handout for the session? So maybe you can address that now, Gavin, to avoid any more questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, there will be a handout, and the handout contains links to everything that you're going to see in the slides, because naturally in the slides I can't go into great detail for a lot of these things, but you'll be able to go off and read those later if you have an interest in AI. So let's start with the life cycle of emerging technologies. One of the most famous models, if you like, for looking at technology adoption is called the Gartner Hype Cycle. And the Gartner Hype Cycle looks at how technologies emerge and where they go. Every year, Gartner produce this hype cycle, the thing you can see here. And the cycle is divided into 5 sections. So at the beginning, well, I'll make this a little bit easier. I'll take a proper example from ELT, we'll talk about the interactive whiteboard, the IWB. So at the beginning, you have an innovation trigger. They used to call this a technology trigger. And that's when something happens, something changes. And some of the things I've already mentioned, broadband, mobiles, smartphones, those are all what you would call an innovation trigger. Something big, something that theoretically changes everything. And interactive whiteboards, when they first came along, they were an innovation trigger. So we went from traditional whiteboards or even chalkboards suddenly to having these amazing boards that could do amazing things. You could drag text around, and you could do gap fills, and you could reveal small bits of images and have students guessing what they were, and all kinds of things. And teachers at the time got very, very excited. And in fact, the British Council was at the forefront, I think, of introduction in interactive whiteboards, because I remember going to some centres, particularly in Hong Kong, which was a huge technology centre for the British Council years ago, and Singapore also. At the time, I visited both those places, and interactive whiteboards were very, very popular. And we all got very excited about them, because the great thing about the interactive whiteboard is it takes an existing paradigm, something that we know, the whiteboard, the chalkboard, and it makes it more interesting. And so what happens, you'll see in the chart, is that when an innovation trigger happens, people get excited and they go up that first line up there, up into the second column, which is what Gartner called the peak of inflated expectations. It's all, the vocabulary is all a little bit of Lord of the Rings in this in the Gartner hype cycle, but we'll stick with it. And the peak of inflated expectations is when the excitement is so big that that's all anybody can talk about. And if you were around when interactive whiteboards came along, that certainly happened. They were everywhere. I remember going to a conference dedicated specifically to interactive whiteboards in education. What happens after this, generally, is that people start, after the initial excitement, people start to examine the technology a little bit more closely. And then they perhaps notice that things aren't quite, it's not the best thing since sliced bread. It's not the education silver bullet. And Gartner would say that they then slide down the slope in the third column to what they call the trough of disillusionment. So all that excitement has finally gone away. And actually, if you look around at most people in their classes, what are they doing with their interactive whiteboards? Well, they're showing PowerPoint slides or they're showing videos from YouTube. So the interaction has gone. They're definitely down there in the trough of disillusionment. Now, sometimes, in fact, in the trough of disillusionment, many technologies disappear. They don't catch on properly and they disappear. But if they do stay, many people will gradually come out of the trough of disillusionment into what Gartner called the slope of enlightenment. So they'll think, actually, but I could do this, or I could do that, or it would be great for this. And often, if they're lucky, they'll end up in the fifth column in the plateau of productivity. And I have seen some amazing interactive whiteboard lessons. Not so many in English language teaching, sadly, but I've seen loads in science and maths. So that would be a typical life cycle of a technology. And the Gartner model is famous. It's been going for many, many years. You'll see in that model, there are all sorts of things that we probably don't know anything about, or at least I shouldn't say you, but I certainly don't recognize many of those terms. But generative AI, you will see, is the last dot on the thing. It's just on the edge of the peak of inflated expectations and heading possibly into the trough of disillusionment. So what about technology in ELT? Well, I think there are two types of users of technology in ELT. There are those people who use it and those people who don't. And there's very little in between generally. But people like me who love technology and love teaching and love teacher training, we have traditionally been easily seduced, let me say. We've liked the shiny lights and I describe it there on the screen. We're like moths to the flame. When a new technology comes along, we flood over to it and we see what we can do with it. And that's fine. But there's an awful lot of history in our profession, history that goes back decades and decades and decades, history of theory and methodology and practice. And we need to keep hold of that. When I was putting together this session, I was reminded of a quotation which came from a book by Mike Levy from 1997. And his book was about CALL, C-A-L-L, which is Computer Assisted Language Learning. And it was this quotation. I'm just going to read it out to you, not because I think you can't read, but because I think it's worth reading. And he said, I believe the CALL, Computer Assisted Language Learning community, needs to build upon what has gone before, rather than be led purely by the capabilities of the latest technological innovation. With the almost monthly appearance of new hardware and software, there can be a tendency for those interested in CALL materials development simply to pick up the latest machine or technological option and get to work on a project. If the technology has not been widely distributed, it is rather too easy to impress. And ever since I came across this quotation, I've kept it in my head when dealing with technology, because like many people, I do get excited by technology. And so I like to think, we need, when anything comes along, not only do we need to look at it from certain lenses and critical approaches, but we also need to question where it fits into our professional canon. Does it fit in, and how does it fit in? It might disrupt traditional pedagogies. It might augment them, might make them better. It might have no effect at all. But we do need to ask ourselves these questions. We can't simply take technologies into our classroom without thinking about them. So let's move on to think about AI. Now, if any of you, well, you might want to put in the chat actually, and I can briefly glance over to my other monitor. Have you used AI in either preparing or delivering your classes? Just type a yes or a no in the text chat for me, and I'll just keep an eye on that as I move on. Wow. Okay. So we've got lots of yeses, mostly yeses at the moment. A few no's, and I tried, which is lovely. I tried to. Absolutely yes, absolutely yes. Okay, so a lot of yeses, which is interesting. AI is not reliable. I'm not lazy. Brilliant. Keep the comments coming. I can't check on all of them, but keep them coming. Okay, so let's think about AI. Now, there are all sorts of AI tools, and they appear daily, and I'm a member of various Facebook groups, AI for Educators, AI for Language Teaching. They are both linked in the handout. And I see tools coming out every day. A tool that will create you a reading and 10 gap fills, a tool that will create you an audio and 7 comprehension questions, all sorts of tools. But I want to go back to basics, really. If there are 2 tools that have had a big impact on all of us who have used AI around the world, they are these 2. On the left, ChatGPT, which I'm sure, or at least I hope most of you have heard of, probably the most famous, what's known as large language model. So the most famous AI that you can chat to, and it'll answer your questions and it'll give you information. And on the right, we have the image equivalent, a piece of software called Midjourney, and Midjourney is used to create images from text prompts. So make me a photo of a man standing on a platform in the underground in London, and Midjourney will attempt to do that. Those are the 2 most famous AI tools. And I want to think a little bit about those as I move forward, but in general, I want to think about where AI comes from and what it's made of or from. Now, there's a very famous acronym from the world of psychology, which is WEIRD. And AI is weird. Let me explain. WEIRD stands for white or Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that perfectly describes most of the AI tools and the AI libraries that you can think of. AI is largely currently, I know there are other systems in other countries, and I know China is a prolific developer of AI tools, most of which obviously we can't see in other countries, so I can't really talk about those, but I do know other countries are making AI models, but predominantly AI models come from the United States of America, and they are developed by companies which are largely white, largely college educated at the very least, but usually PhD level. The US is obviously an industrialized country. In many parts, it's rich and, well, democratic. We'll leave there. To add to that, I think there's another singularly important thing about AI, and that is it is mostly, apart from being weird, it is also male. Very, very male. Only about 12% of researchers involved in AI are female. So 88% of the things produced by AI, the content and the algorithms, these are collected, collated, analyzed, and reinterpreted through a male lens, predominantly. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And it is the weirdness and the male side of things that produces some of the most telling issues with AI. And I'd like to look at those briefly now through some examples. So what are the issues with the AI? Well, primarily, AI, due to its weirdness, has a lot of biases. It has biases in all sorts of areas. One of the biggest areas is perhaps its bias in terms of race. Most AI, when asked, will produce results due to the training material that it's trained on, which are negligent of other races and other cultures. So smaller cultures, I live in Wales, and Wales is a pretty small culture globally. And prior to that, I lived in Catalonia in northeastern Spain, which is also a fairly small culture in its own way. But you won't find, you'd be very hard pushed to find examples of material in those contexts being given to you when you ask. There are all sorts of examples. I don't have time to go into all of them, of course, or indeed any of them probably, and that's why I've linked them in the document that you will get, the handout at the end. But there are all sorts of examples where the bias is looked at. But I want to show you an image which I generated using, well, a couple of images I generated using Midjourney. And I asked for a photo of a secondary school class, so high school, secondary school class in London. And these are the images I got. Now, I could, I guess, have just taken these into a classroom and done a class about, I don't know, education or classroom layouts. Thanks, Vincent. I think Vincent in the chat has just pointed out the most striking thing about those images, and that is that they are all white. Yes, now if you were to go into a secondary school class in London, you certainly wouldn't see an all-white set of kids. You would certainly see black kids, probably Asian. You'd see kids from all around the world, really. But AI will not show me that because it's London, therefore they must be white. This is, well, you can see it in all sorts of examples. Here's another example. I asked for an image of a busy street in Sydney, Australia. If anyone's ever been to Sydney, you will know that it is a hugely culturally diverse city. People from all sorts of cultures and countries are there. But yet, if you look closely at that photo, most of it's blurred, obviously, because of the number of people, but you will see that they are pretty much white, middle class, handsome or beautiful, well-dressed people. We do know that the world isn't quite like that. The issue for me, I think, is do our students know that? Do our learners know these things? Or should we be telling them about these things? But it's not just culture and cultures. It's also gender. We know this, well, for all sorts of research, but why do you think that the first AI chatbots like Siri and Alexa, why do you think they were female voices and not men? And what does it say about us? I have this running discussion with my my business partner, Nikki, who is a woman, about whether one should be polite to chatbots. I always say please and thank you. I say, Alexa, could you turn on the kitchen light, please? Now Alexa's talking to me. But I always say please. And when I write in ChatGPT, I say, please, could you look at this file and tell me X, Y, and Z? Why? Well, because a lot of research shows that most people simply bark orders at AI. Turn on the lights. Look at this. But there's a very, very subtle little thing in there, and that is that what we are doing essentially is barking orders without the niceties at women. Now, they may be electronic women, but they're female voices. What does that do about reinforcing stereotypes in terms of our interactions between genders? It may seem very silly to suggest that us shouting at Siri is part of a gender bias, but there is something in there. And in fact, there's plenty of research to back that up. But it's not just things like that. AI is also biased in terms of recruiting. This was an article where Amazon were using a recruiting tool, and the tool was systematically weeding out women so that they weren't getting through to interview. The same has been shown with Black people in the States, that they often get weeded out. But if you don't think this is a problem, and please be polite to voice assistants, but if you don't see this as a problem, here is an interaction between two users. Now, I've spared you the blushes by asterisking out the bad word in that, but the user says, hey Siri, you're and Siri says, I'd blush if I could. Now, that is not an appropriate reaction to that kind of comment. In fact, if I said a similar thing to any woman I know, they certainly wouldn't answer with, I'd blush if I could. But it's a telling thing that Siri is programmed to answer with that response. And that comes from a UNESCO report called I'd Blush If I Could, which is also referenced in the handout. But the bias goes deeper. The gender bias goes deeper. Here are some more prompts from Midjourney. A teacher writing on the board. Look at the teacher, male, sort of middle age, vaguely handsome, I suppose, if you like a beard. An engineer working in an office, white, male. A scientist, an engineer. A doctor performing surgery. A scientist in a laboratory. There's a theme here you may have spotted. All these professional people are white men. Even the footballer. My wife is a qualified football coach and a goalkeeper, and she was horrified when it came up with 4 pictures, all of male footballers. However, good news, there are some women in the AR world. There's a nurse, for example. So the doctor's there working on his things, and the nurse is tending to the patients, as nurses do. You can do a very, very quick search anywhere. AI has a female representation issue. It's very tricky to get what you might call a normal looking person, woman, that is, from AI. Here are some examples. This is a prompt for a female teacher standing in front of her class. Now, what does that tell you? Well, let me show you the other 3 images that came out of that prompt. So these are all the 4 images that were produced from that prompt. Now, you've probably been to school. I certainly have. I don't remember teachers looking like that or dressing like that, because frankly, that isn't real. Things are getting better slowly, but it's too slow. And it is more, you are 90% guaranteed to get what most people might consider to be an attractive woman if you prompt for a woman in a photograph. Men, well, men, you know, we've all got beards and glasses. We're all a little bit ripped, you know, a few muscles here and there. But we're good looking. So that's good. There is no normality in AI. And in fact, it's not just gender. And it's not just race. It's also what we might call ableist. That is, it's biased towards able-bodied people and people who don't have any impairments or challenges in their lives. So if I prompt, for example, of a photo of someone in a wheelchair, here's what I get. Now, what does that tell you about the lives of people in wheelchairs? Well, it tells me that they're all on their own because nobody wants to talk to them. They're all sitting, staring at societies that they can play no part in, and they're having a terrible, terrible life. However, if I ask AI to show me a photo of someone in a wheelchair looking at the camera, guess what I get? Quickly in the chat, what do you think I get if I ask for a photo of someone in a wheelchair looking at a camera? Depressed and sad, smiling, partying, sad, happy, sad person. Excellent, brilliant. No, I get pretty ladies again, because that's all that AI can produce. So that's the same prompt, but looking at the camera, and that's what you get. Now, I know I have been keeping my eye briefly on the chat, which is why you see me occasionally glancing to the left, because I'm kind of interested in what you're saying. And one of the big things that's come out in 2 or 3 comments is that you can change the prompts to get other photos. My answer to that is that you shouldn't have to change the prompts to get representation of gender, race, ability. You shouldn't have to write a specific prompt like, show me a picture of an average looking man in a wheelchair engaging in normal social activities like everybody else does. You shouldn't have to do that. The AI needs to reflect the societies that we all live in. And we all live in societies where there are women and other races and people in wheelchairs. So we shouldn't have to do that. There are other issues. The people producing the large language models and the content that AI produce, they are in what we might call economically disadvantaged countries. And they're being paid peanuts, nothing, to produce the AI that I get to use in my weird Western educated context. But worse than that, because they're being paid to produce what we want, they're also being paid to undermine their own countries and cultures, to not add things about their own countries and cultures, because apparently that's not what we want. A couple more issues, and then I promise I'll get on to something a little bit more positive. The first issue is the environmental issue behind AI. Every time we produce an image and every time we produce a gap fill and a reading text and an AI, we are using the most extraordinary amounts of water and electricity. And this isn't sustainable, really isn't sustainable. And so you see in recent news, Google is now reopening old nuclear reactors in the States in order to feed the AI machines. But we're not doing ourselves any favor in terms of the future of the planet at all with AI. And lastly, I suppose, it's the fact that AI, not only does it invent beautiful people, it invents unfeasible and incorrect information, what the AI world calls hallucinations. It invents articles. it invents books that people have written, and it invents information. And if we take this information into our classrooms, what are we doing in terms of helping our learners to work out what is right or wrong or real or not real? I think when I first started working in technology, we taught people how to search properly on Google and how to compare search results and how to make sure that what they used from what they found in Google was right. So we asked them to look at 3 sources to check their data. The kind of things I think that we're taught at university, you know, how to quote things and how to make sure that they're accurate and real. But how do you do that in an AI world when things are invented? I guess you have to go back to Google, put the name of the article and the author of the article and see if it exists. People's lives, of course, meanwhile, are being affected by this kind of thing. And hallucinations are a real challenge. I think they're a challenge for us because we live in, I guess, what most people now call a post-truth world, where the truth is so manipulated on social media and things that we need to make sure that our learners can tell the difference between these things. And lastly, and possibly the biggest challenge of them all, the problem of them all, is what's known as model collapse. And that is that AI models are now being fed with AI generated content. So things that have been generated by AI are going back into the AI, but they are going back into the AI as facts. And model collapse suggests that one day the whole thing will collapse because there will be so much false rubbish in the model that they simply won't work or serve any function anymore. Now, well, that's the depressing part out of the way. But these are massive challenges for us. I haven't been able to keep up with the text chat, and so if there are any questions specific to any of those issues, please do put them in the Q&A, and we'll come to them, because I'm going to finish in about 5 or 6 minutes or so, and then we can
There are a
come
few, Gavin, about biases. We'll maybe come to those in the Q&A.
Yes, yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know lots of people are chatting in the chat, and
Yeah.
hopefully I'll be able to get the script later and have a look through it. But I know, I'm a realist. I know that teachers are using these things in their classes because they're quick, and I don't have an issue with that. And and AI is pretty good at producing fairly anodyne text. So if you say to an AI, "Can you produce me a 500-word reading at B2 level about the Beijing Olympics," then it will produce a text. There will be some problems with that text. Some of the words will be above B2 level, and that's been well documented. AI doesn't really understand the levels that we use, A1, A2, B1, 2, those kind of things. So it'll make an attempt to keep it at kind of mid to upper intermediate level, but it won't be able to do that it won't do it in the way that materials writers will do it, where they will ensure that all the words are within that level. But it will make a text, and the text will probably be okay, and it will make some comprehension questions for you, and they will probably be okay, although you'll need to check them. But of course it saves time, and you can generate photos, and that will save you time as well. And I think, I don't have a problem per se, well, outside of what I've already said. I don't have a problem with people using these technologies, but I do think that we need to think very carefully about why and how we're using them. Now, the first thing I think we need to do is the bias. The bias for me, is the most important thing. I think we need to address these biases head on in class, and I think we need to address them repeatedly. So it's not just enough. A great example for a class would be the generation of images. So you get students to generate, it might be a speaking activity or a short writing activity. I've seen this done, I've done it myself. Generate a picture of a person, give it a description, an age range, clothes, blah, 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 blah. and let the AI generate that picture. And then I've seen teachers take those pictures and make a speaking activity out of them, or a writing activity about, all these people are on a train. Describe the relationship between them, that kind of thing. Great activity, nothing wrong with the activity. The problem there for me is, what do the photos look like? Are they all beautiful or handsome middle-class white people? If they are, there's a good learning point in the classroom. So no problem with the activity, but let's have a look at the images. What does it tell us? What do these images tell us about the world? And then maybe, as people have suggested in the chat, try to see if you can generate people from other cultures. And it will generally, when specifically prompted, AI like Midjourney will generate people from other countries. And then maybe have a discussion about it. A lot of the activities that my writing partner, Nikki, and I put in our activities are often awareness raising activities. And I think these are massively important with technology, where we know that these things are not bias free or not values free. The second thing I think we need to do is, if we're allowing our learners to generate things with AI, we need to teach them how to check those things. And again, there, I think we'd have to go back to Google, and we'd have to teach some of those traditional, what I would call now traditional skills of how to search properly in Google, how to cross-check results, how to make sure, as Anira says in the chat, recheck, and recheck, and that's very good advice. We also need to make sure that learners are acknowledging their sources. Now, I came across this fantastic post, which I think I referenced in the handout, which was on Reddit, kind of social media platform. And it was from a college level student in the US. And he said, my professors won't let us use AI in our assignments, but they're using AI to mark our assignments. And I thought, well, there's possibly the worst example you can think of using AI. But it does beg the question, do we come to a point soon where teachers are using AI to generate tasks, and then learners are using AI to do those tasks, and then teachers are using AI to mark those tasks? And if we do, where is the learning in that process? One thing I'm firmly against AI being used for, and that is to mark student work. The thing that we as teachers bring to our learners is our experience and our knowledge, and above all, our knowledge of them as individual learners and our sensitivity. And if we allow machines to correct their work, we're taking all of those things away, all of those possible noticing the gaps and developmental opportunities that really good teacher feedback provides. Teacher feedback is one of the most amazing things in the world when it's done properly. But if we are to allow our learners to use AI, then we need to encourage them to acknowledge their sources. Where did they get them from? How much of this was generated? How much did you write? And as with all technologies, I go back to something that Nikki and I have worked on for years, particularly around mobile device use, which has always been divisive, and that is developing an acceptable use policy, co-developing with your learners. What will we use AI for? What will we not use it for? We all sign on to this kind of contract. And if you're going to allow them to use these things, then you're definitely going to have to rethink not only your tasks, but your tests. Because if your learners can use AI in the tasks or the tests, then you can no longer be sure whether they've learned anything much at all, I don't think. So we need to think about what we're testing a little bit. And then we need to evaluate the learning that happens in AI enhanced learnings. We're very good at measuring the learning that happens in traditional classes. I think we know what we're looking for, we know what we're doing, we know what we hope they're doing, and we know where to look to see whether people are learning or not. And of course, we monitor, we walk around the room, we listen to people, we look at what they're doing, we look at them doing exercises or writing or speaking, and we're very good at evaluating that. But how do we evaluate AI enhanced lessons? And then finally, I think whatever that was in the chat, which I liked, check, recheck, and recheck, is think about whether you need to do it. I don't want to be too dramatic about this, but every time you use AI, you are potentially, between inverted commas, killing a tree or drying up a well or a dam or something. And so I think we need to, rather than just sitting constantly playing with these tools, we need to figure out what they do well, and stick to that, and not spend our time experimenting all the time when we perhaps have bigger challenges in our classrooms. I'm going to stop and open up for the Q&A. Just one second. First, before we go to the Q&A, I just want to say thank you very much for this. I know it's been not the most fun of sessions, but AI is massive at the moment, and I do think we need to think about it. So should we go over to the Q&A?
Sure. Thanks very much, Gavin. That's great. I think we've got about just under 10 minutes left. Got one question here from China that I think is a comment that leads into a very nice question from my colleague Chen, who someone from the China audience says, thanks for the awareness raising session. Very thought provoking, which is exactly my comment as well. And the question is, in the context of classroom teaching, any recommendations for us English teachers to avoid falling into some of the traps that you've mentioned?
I suppose, well, first, being aware of them is important, and I think one of the big pitfalls or holes that people fall into is just doing something like generating an image or a text and then running with it, going straight into class and using it. And I remember when I first started teaching a long time ago, 1989, in Spain, we used to have an ideas board on the wall. If a teacher came up with a great teaching idea for a course book, they would pin it on the wall. And there were teachers who never looked at the wall, and there were teachers who always looked at the wall because they did no preparations. So they would come in 5 minutes before the lesson started, they would rip 2 of these things off the board, photocopy them, stick them back, and go into class with them. And it's kind of what I think we need to avoid is the AI equivalent of that. So if we are to use AI, then I think we just need to look at what we're using. When we generate a picture, look at it critically. Is that, for example, are my learners represented in that photo? I mean, you may not need your learners represented in that particular photo, but you may, and we know from decades of history that learners, when they feel represented and acknowledged and noticed, that has an impact on their learning. So I think I've never been a massive fan of course books, but they're written by experts and they are good generally. I'm not, I think they're a little bit one flavored, but they're crafted with love and professionalism and skill and experience. And I think, if I was, one piece of advice is, do you need the AI? Does it make your lesson better or more interesting?
And I think, Gavin, if I can interrupt there, that leads very nicely to the next question, which came in quite early from Darina, about not even quarter of an hour, maybe 5 or 10 minutes into your presentation. But I see a number of questions around the topic of balance. So Darina asked, what do you think is the most effective method to keep that balance, a good balance between using AI in the classroom and building up students' independence and critical thinking? And I think some of the other questions about balance were also relating to the issues of the teachers themselves as well, kind of striking that balance.
Yeah.
And again, the kind of follow-up question, how to engage AI and how to use AI, but without overusing it. So again, that idea of balance.
Balance in terms of the use of technology in teaching has always been the kind of holy grail, really, of technology use. And I can't begin to tell you how many thousands of hours of discussions have gone on over the years about the balance. And in fact, when people created the term blended learning, so some face-to-face, some online, the models were always drawn or often drawn in terms of balance. You know, it will be 60% face-to-face and 40% online, or 70-30 or whatever. So we've always had this idea that there is a balance.
Mm.
And I'm not entirely sure there is a balance. So what would I do? You know, if I was going into a class this afternoon and I was doing, I don't know, let's say a class on disappearing world languages, let's say, you know, languages which are dropping off, you know, they're going to have no speakers left in a few years. So I'd look at my course book. Obviously, it would have stuff in there. That's the unit I'm doing on disappearing world languages. So I would look at my course book and I would think, are those materials good enough? Are they stimulating enough? And if there are disappearing languages in my region where I teach, are they represented?
Mm.
And let's say I can answer yes to the first two. The materials are good enough and they're stimulating enough, but local languages aren't represented. Then I might think about bringing in AI there, for example. So
Mhm.
I might have my students go and try to find out which languages in the region are disappearing, how many speakers are left, what's being done to preserve those languages. So I can see a use case for AI in that third point. But if the materials are good enough in the first two, I don't see any point to using it particularly.
Mhm.
I mean, I think this kind of skill comes with a few years of teaching experience. You know, obviously, you know, we need to be able to look at materials and know whether they're good. They also come with confidence. I think what I would say about technology more than anything is technology is a matter of confidence. It's not a matter of skill. Particularly, anyone can learn how to use AI or Excel or whatever. It's about confidence. It's about going into the classroom and selling something with confidence, like we do with the English language. We do that
Mm.
because we believe in it. You've got to do that with technology, but students are a little bit like pack dogs in a way. If they sense reluctance on the teacher's part or a lack of confidence, they're going to pounce, and they're going to pounce on you big time. So first, I would say get good at AI. Second, you know, make sure you're up to speed on the biases. And then third, think about whether it really impacts on what you do. If it doesn't, and that's the same with any technology, if it's not going to have an impact, leave it at home or leave it out of the classroom. And if it is, make sure it's for a very good reason. That would be my answer.
Great, thanks, Gavin. There's so many questions coming in, and I know we're not going to have a lot
No, I know.
enough time to answer all of them. Unfortunately, you know how it is in these sessions. But it's thank you to all of you for submitting your questions and also for commenting in the chat as well. One question perhaps to finish.
Yeah.
Maybe looking to the future from this again came in relatively early from Vicente, who asked, "What do you think is or are going back to the cycle, the 5 stages cycle?" From Gartner Hype Cycle. What do you think is or are the limits of using AI in English or in language teaching?
So, I mean, I think the basic answer to that is we don't know yet.
Sure.
Because it's actually a very new technology. And I've seen some interesting things. Duolingo is one example. Now, I dislike Duolingo with a passion because I'm not sure it serves any greater purpose than a phrase book did back in the 80s when I was trying to learn Italian with my sister in a bedroom, you know. But Duolingo has some pretty clever AI built into it now. So if you make a mistake with a tense, for example, let's say the classic present perfect in English, then Duolingo is capable of explaining to you more about the present perfect and more about the rules and regulations and why it's done and the difference between for and since and all that. That's kind of clever. It doesn't quite get up to the teacher's level of saying, no, actually, we don't do that because, but you know, I think that's clever. There are lots of little things, what we might call a universal translator, you know, where people can go a lot. You've probably seen adverts for that little flip phone that shows let's say the Japanese on one side and the English on the other side. So you can go into a shop and they're in Japan and they see the Japanese and you see the English and you can speak. These things are brilliant. Are they going to change language teaching? I don't know. I mean, people have been predicting the death of language teaching for a long, long time. My good friend Jeremy Harmer says when he has a question, it's when did candles become obsolete? And he says they didn't become obsolete when electric light came along because they serve another purpose. You know, they serve the purpose of romantic dinners or Gothic castles or whatever. So we're not going to be replaced. A lot of these things aren't feasible. A third of the world is still not connected to the internet. Half of the world has massive data connection charges. So saying that everyone will soon be allowed, walking around with a headpiece with automatic translation happening is rubbish. It's never going to happen. Not for everyone in the world. If I could make predictions about where I was going to go, I'd be a very, very rich man. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say I think that the AI folk are just getting started, and there will be a lot more. I suspect, however, that in the language teaching profession, we're pretty safe for the moment because we bring something that they can't bring: humanity. And language learning and language practice is basically about humans. That would be my conclusion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gavin. And I think with that final word back to humans, I think we're running out of time. So I will just to say, because again, lots of people, thanks everyone for all your thanks to Gavin, and we'll do that formally in a few minutes. But again, just to wrap up, hopefully you can see on the screen now, for those of you who are asking about the certificates, for those of you who are in China, if you've got your phones available, please look on the right-hand side. You'll see the QR code for the China audience, and on the left-hand side for everyone else in ASEAN and around the rest of the globe, you can use the QR code on the left-hand side. And just very quick, I'll share those in a moment. So for the China audience, how to get your certificate, you can see on the screen there. Please scan the code, copy the URL into your web browser, insert your name and select the session that you've attended. So today's Gavin's session on AI, and complete and submit the survey and the certificate. It won't pop out automatically on the platform, but if you go back to the certificate platform, you can then download the certificate. Okay, so that's for those of you in China. For those of you in the rest of the globe, including our ASEAN audience, please use this QR code that's on the screen now, submit the survey, you'll see a thank you message, and click the link below, and then you can download the certificate and edit your name onto the certificate. But please note that it's much easier in fact, this I think is only possible if you do use this on a desktop or a laptop rather than on a mobile phone, preferably using Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge. And then you can delete the standard name and surname and insert your own name and save the PDF and print that out. So that's for those of you in the rest of the globe. And a final reminder, your final chance to scan the QR codes depending on where in the world you are. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, very fast. So that's it. For those of you who are in China, the next session is tomorrow evening at the same time, 7 o'clock in China, where the speaker is Wu Man, and the session you can see there broadening the boundaries of English classrooms using international teaching resources. So that's at the same time tomorrow from 7 till 8. But for those, and you have another week of sessions, I think there are about 11 more sessions, including the one tomorrow in China. But for those of you in ASEAN and around the rest of the globe, Gavin is our final speaker. So a huge thanks to Gavin and to all of you for participating over the past 4 weeks. It's been an amazing 4 weeks. Remember, there's lots of resources, lots of webinars, courses, and all kinds of lesson plans and activities and readings and publications on our Teaching English platform. So please do keep looking out there, and there will be plenty more events over the next few weeks and months. And hopefully we'll be back here for our ASEAN conference iteration number 3 next year in 2025. So to those of you in ASEAN and the rest of the globe, a huge thanks for your participation, and a huge thanks to Gavin for your presentation this evening. As we saw from the range of questions, very thought-provoking, very hot topic, and a great chance to think about that as we go forward. And to those of you in China, enjoy the rest of the conference. But with that, I'll say thank you. Thanks, Gavin.
Bye, folks.
Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all very soon somewhere. Thanks, everybody. Have a really great evening. Bye for now.